So we'll go ahead and begin. Thank you again, and welcome to this special event, COVID-19 Vaccines and the Future of Normal Life. Remember what that was like? So welcome. We're so glad to have you here for this conversation with David Lowe and Georgia Warnke. And as we begin, I want to invite you to acknowledge, take a moment to just recognize, if you will, the community that's represented in this meeting. As part of the UC Riverside campus, we respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of the land on which the campus sits. The Cahuilla, the Tongva, the Luisiano, and the Serrano peoples, all their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, the Riverside campus, as you know, is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on these homelands. And we hope that the pending and forthcoming vaccines and the public health measures that we talk about in this meeting today can enable us to come back together in person sooner rather than later. So a few notes of housekeeping. You'll notice that our webinar today is being recorded. The video from the conversation will be posted on our website next week. Our website address is ideasandsociety.ucr.edu, and I'll post that web address in the chat in just a few moments. You can use the chat to share comments and say hello to everyone in the meeting, and you can also use the Q&A button. If you hover over your Zoom meeting screen, you'll see Q&A. You can click into that screen and enter your questions, and we'll hope to address many, if not all of those questions later on this hour. So that's it from me. I'll hand the meeting over now to Dr. Warnke. Georgia?
Thank you. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Professor Lowe for agreeing to this command performance. We thought we'd begin with I'm going to simply ask some questions, and then after about 35 to 40 minutes, or maybe earlier, depending how fast we get through my questions, we'll open it up to all of you. I thought I'd begin by asking a few questions to kind of set the background before we get to the questions that I think are on everybody's mind about a vaccine, when it will come, what it'll mean, what it won't mean, and what the possibilities are for a return to a semi-normal or quasi-normal life. So I thought I'd begin with a question about the difference that COVID-19 poses. We've had flu seasons every year, and we had a swine flu pandemic back in 2009. So I guess my first question to you, David, is what's the difference? What's different about COVID-19?
Well, the difference I would really put down to arithmetic in a sense, is the biology of the virus, any virus that spreads through the community is a combination of two factors. One is how easily does it get transmitted from one person to the next? So that's kind of like transmission rate. And so you have things like the common cold or the flu that are really highly transmissible. And so that can be one factor. The other factor is basically how sick you get and how likely you are to die from the infection. And so those two factors affect what we think is going on. So if you have something like the common cold, nobody dies from the common cold. So even though it's really highly transmissible and it goes around the community really quickly, we don't get too upset about it. On the other direction, you have things like bird flu, Ebola virus, things like that, where about 2/3 of the people who catch it are likely to actually die. Well, of course, that's a scary thing. However, in those cases, it's so poorly transmitted that we never see it here. So COVID is one of those scary things because it has, I guess, sort of the best of both worlds. It's more easily transmissible, and there's a significant proportion of people who actually can get very sick with long-term consequences, and a significant number of people who actually die from it. So you have things like the 1918 flu, where it was like other influenza viruses can be transmitted quite well. And even though it was only 2% or so that may actually die, if that is easily spread through the population, that flu killed between 50 and 100 million people. And so our concern with the COVID-19 virus is that it can spread through the community, and it may not kill people right away. So in the long run, there's risk that millions and millions of people could ultimately die, and far more can have long-term consequences, because it's not just a pulmonary virus. It actually can cause a lot of cardiovascular effects, a lot of other internal organ types of things. And so the long-term consequences, and especially if we're not able to control its spread, is just, this kind of scary thought. And this week, as you may have heard, we now have the highest rate of new infections we've ever seen in the whole year-long pandemic, in this country, that is. And so that discussion of that potential for millions of people to die in this country is still a very real possibility. And it's that arithmetic, as I said, it's like the ability to spread easily from one person to another, and the fact that a significant proportion are going to die.
So here's a follow-up question. So how exactly does COVID-19 affect the body? So we've been reading about these long-term consequences. Even if you survive and even if you don't get that sick, there seem to be long-term consequences. And we've also been reading about the way it seems to affect different groups in different ways. I guess that's two questions. One, how does it affect the body? And two, why does it affect the bodies of some groups or people worse than other groups? How can some people have just a mild case and other people die or nearly die?
So a virus can cause problems in your body in a couple of different ways. One is, if the virus infects a certain type of cell, it could basically, as it reproduces, it can just basically kill that cell during the process of reproduction. A second way in which a virus can cause a problem is that if the body is responding to the infection and producing inflammation, getting like all these cells into the tissues trying to kill the virus, the response itself can cause damage, all right? So COVID actually causes two types of damage. One is that the receptor for the virus is actually in the blood vessel wall. So all the cells that line your blood vessels are expressing receptors for that virus, which means that it's not just limited to infecting cells in the lung. It affects cells in the brain, it affects cells in the kidney, things like that. And those cells that line the blood vessels, when they are infected by the virus, produce other types of risk, because if you do damage to the blood vessels, you raise the possibility of vascular problems like stroke, things like that. And so people have done pathology analysis of people who have died from COVID, and they see that in the lungs, for example, there are blood clots all over. The same kind of thing is a risk in the brain, and obviously you don't want blood clots in your brain either. So that's one kind of consequence. The other is a later consequence where your immune system is supposed to try and fight against disease. And the immune system comes in and brings all their first responders, all the troops come in and try and fight the virus infection. But the way it does that is that the response of the immune system can get a little bit out of hand. I mean, it's trying to do its job, right? But if it gets a little bit too out of hand, that can cause damage in its own right. And so the consequences of an overactive immune response can cause tissue damage, can cause, again, blood vessel problems, tissue damage, all of those kinds of things. And so one of the drugs that has been shown to work, which is dexamethasone, is helpful in people with severe disease because it's trying to shut down that overactive, hyperactive immune response. Now, it's a scary prospect in the sense that dexamethasone is immunosuppressive. So people are worried that if you give immunosuppressive drugs too early, it actually, instead of just shutting down the damaging effects of the hyperactive immune response, it could actually prevent your immune system from doing its job in the first place. So it's a matter of timing as well. So we don't really have drugs that can prevent the damage. It's basically you try to manage the disease when it gets into a really bad, situation. So the vascular damage is especially that kind of concern, because when you have that kind of vascular damage, whether you're a young person or an old person, those kind of effects can last for a long time. The other concern, though, is that we have some evidence that the immune response may not absolutely wipe out the virus or may not absolutely protect you from reinfection. And so the question is also whether long-term consequences are because you haven't really absolutely cleared out the virus, or the small number or rare cases of people actually getting reinfected. Hopefully that's the kind of thing where if you had a good vaccine, it could do better than your own immune response.
Good. And we've also been reading that certain groups have a difficult time and much higher rates of infection and higher mortality rates. And why is that, and what can we do about it? Is it access to healthcare?
Well, this is, we have this Center for Health Disparities Research, and one of the things we look at a lot is this whole question of health disparities. So what you're describing is the fact that a lot of groups, minority populations, especially the African American, Latino populations, and some Asian American populations, have higher mortality, higher death rates, and even higher infection rates. But there's actually quite a long list of things that contribute to that, right? So for example, among many of these populations, say Latino populations, for example, where many of them are in service industries, agriculture, food services, manufacturing, things like that, because they can't, we're sitting here doing this by Zoom. They can't sit at home and pick, crops by Zoom. So they're going to be exposed. They're going to be out in the environment. So they're going to be more susceptible to exposure just because of their job if they want to have an income. Another thing is that these are populations where we've always known that they suffer from a lot of health disparity issues. And that there's a whole long conversation there too. Many of them have to do with healthcare access. So, do they delay treatment and wait till they're sick enough that they have to go to the emergency room? Well, that's of course not helpful because then you don't get early treatment. The other issue is more central to this whole question of health disparities, is that we know that many of these minority, under-resourced, underserved populations have additional factors that affect this kind of health disparities. We can attribute a lot of that to things that we can point to and we know are true, like, structural racism, those kinds of things that in terms of whether they're actually treated properly, as well as the more, better resourced, but also just the stress of being in one of these communities where treatment, conditions, society's views and things like that has an intrinsic stress as well. And stress is not good, right? So even if you count things like, if you look at obesity as a risk factor or diabetes as a risk factor, if you look at white populations and minority populations, the impact of COVID is still disproportionate on these minority groups, even if you account for the incidence of obesity, because it's actually quite similar in these groups, yet the impact is still worse in these groups. So there's all these other, there's this whole many layers of factors that affect susceptibility, likelihood of infection, and outcomes that go from the way our society is structured and the way it operates, as well as real serious clinical effects of stressful living among basically a group that has to deal with their ongoing structural racism issues and so on. So it's certainly not something that's going to be fixed just by putting more doctors out there, or even universal health care, as much as it may do. We still have to address the structural racism aspects that really put the stress on these individuals.
Okay, so let's turn to the vaccine, the possibility of the vaccine. First of all, why a vaccine? What's wrong with herd immunity, or the idea of herd immunity? It's just that too many people would die, or it doesn't work?
Well, herd immunity is a real thing. Again, it's a matter of arithmetic. So if you do math, whether you're doing mathematical modeling or actually looking at how this works in the community, herd immunity is basically in our society is something that generally only happens when you have vaccines that are very effective. So if we look at things like measles, whooping cough, things like that, the concept is that herd immunity is that there's enough people in the community that are already immune and protected, so that if somebody flies in from overseas and is infected, the likelihood of that person going to Disneyland and infecting a dozen people is minimized if everybody's already immune. And so even if you have, say, an immunosuppressed person or a young child or an old person who may be susceptible, that disease may not reach them because too many other people in the community are not susceptible and therefore cannot spread the disease. Now, the way we've done that in a modern civilization is that all those people had been vaccinated. The only other way you can get herd immunity is, again, by the math, is that if the vaccination rate is 80 to 90%, then you can have herd immunity. If the vaccination rate drops below 80%, like in the case of measles, for example, you have outbreaks because that herd immunity is lost. If you're relying on natural infection, that means to achieve that level of protection, the only way you're going to get that immunity is that if all those people, instead of having a vaccine, actually get the infection and recover. That means you are asking to infect 80 to 90% of the population. Now that means if 1 to 2% of them are going to die from the natural infection, let's do the math. In this country, you're talking about maybe 6 million people you're asking to die for the sake of herd immunity. That's not, for most of us, that's not acceptable, right?
So why was it acceptable, say, to Sweden? Why did they?
Well, I think that was, I would say that Sweden was counting on people in the community to behave responsibly. And as it turned out, initially it looked like that was so, but in the end, Sweden had more than double the rates of all the other Scandinavian countries.
Right.
And their economy was worse than the other Scandinavian countries because they didn't control it. So I don't see that Sweden is a good example for anybody to follow. it was basically the absence of a plan. And unfortunately, that's what we have here is like, if you're saying, oh, let's do herd immunity, that means you simply don't have a plan because you don't want to deal with it.
Okay, so you said that the drive to develop a COVID-19 vaccine is called warp speed. Is that how vaccines were developed in the past? And is that how they're maybe going to be developed in the future? What is this warp speed and how does it work?
Well, the warp speed thing is what the present administration has called it, and they put billions of dollars into a handful of hand-picked companies to put billions of dollars into developing these. So let's set aside the name warp speed for now, but vaccine development until now has had very slow progress. So so even the fastest development of vaccine took 10 years. However, we know that in our society, we're used to vaccines doing a lot of important things. Although, let me put it this way, we too easily forget that we used to have polio. We used to have smallpox. We used to have things that were devastating in the community, but vaccines and the associated herd immunity were wonderful. However, all of those took, 10 years or more to develop. And the reason is because there's a couple of factors. One is, of course, it takes science and research, and things don't happen overnight. If they do, you shouldn't invest in it because it's probably not, it's too good to be true, right? The other factor is that vaccine technology has always been slow because of the other factor, and it's more economic, which is that drug companies, when there used to be dozens of companies making vaccines, there were, in this country, there were really closer to half a dozen that was doing any kind of serious vaccine work. And the reason is because your customers are generally governments and not individuals with insurance. The meaning of that is that governments will negotiate a good, reasonable price. Well, if you're a drug company, that's the last thing you want. What you want is to make exorbitant profits from some drug that'll cure hepatitis for $200,000 a patient. Well, that is not a good business model if you're in the drug business. And so vaccine technology has basically languished for decades because it hasn't had that kind of investment because it doesn't have that same profit margin that's expected. So the factors in terms of scientific progress as well as economics has basically said that vaccine development hasn't been as effective. Now the warp speed thing is kind of an interesting thing because it's like now we're faced with a pandemic and we have an urgent need, and all those technologies that were waiting in the wings are now being getting money thrown at them. And so it's an interesting time because we are watching scientific progress live as it's happening. Now that means there's going to be a certain amount of chaos. Whether it means we'll get any faster toward a good vaccine is not as clear because we still have to go through evidence, research and things like that. The thing to think about too is that all of these warp speed technologies that are being tested have never been approved by the FDA before. So these are basically all new, untried, untested until now. Now that on the one hand, I think, well, that's fantastic. We're finally doing what we should have been doing. On the other hand, we need to be that much more cautious because look, we've never had a vaccine using this technology before. So now we want to be extra careful that it really isn't going to cause harm. And instead it's going to actually be a new innovative technology like, the next iPhone or, something like that. So while we are hoping for rapid success, at the same time, we need to temper it with caution and making sure that we don't jump into the deep end too quickly. So I'll give you an example. So in the 70s, remember Gerald Ford was president, and we were worried about a different pandemic. It was the thought that the swine flu was going to devastate the world. Scientists had predicted something like that was going to happen. Now, as it turned out, they were wrong. But Ford had pushed out a flu vaccine really quickly before all of the testing had been done. In the end, it turned out to be a mistake because not only was the pandemic didn't happen, but the worst thing was that the vaccine that went out there actually caused hundreds, maybe thousands of cases of a paralytic disease called Guillain-Barré. And so, there's a reason we have 3 phases of clinical trials. We want to test, not only is it not immediately toxic, we want to test that it's really effective, but we also want to test significant numbers of people to see whether these weird kinds of unanticipated, side effects that need some real study, and to see whether it was caused by the vaccine and not just some statistical fluke. So those things take time, and that's why I think it's nice to see that, for example, California and Washington and New York and some of these states are saying, we are only going to distribute the vaccines once we've had a chance to confirm that, yes, it was tested according to what we think are rigorous scientific standards. Now, it is still possible that we may still see a vaccine within the year. So that would still be an incredible, rapid pace of advance. But I think at least we can count on people to say, let's make sure that it's a good vaccine. And I'll tell you, as soon as one of those has gone through good, close examination, I'll definitely be in line to take it.
So can we go back? You were talking about these technologies, and I think I missed something. So there have been these technologies that just weren't being funded. And with COVID, they're now taking these technologies that were sort of on the shelf and developing them. Is that what's happening?
Right. So there are several different types of technologies. One is synthetic nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are basically, that genetic blueprint that codes for proteins and things like that. And so for many years, it had not been successful. So now newer versions of synthetic nucleic acids are being tested because they don't get degraded right away, stuff like that. And they can cause inflammatory reactions on their own, whether or not they produce an immune response. And so there's some risk of side effects. Other versions, some of these I describe, I'm sorry, they're going to sound like science fiction movies yet to be made, where they take a virus that is supposedly not causing a disease, and then they take the genes for the COVID coat protein, and they stick it into this virus, like a virus that may cause a common cold. So adenovirus is one of these, right? And so then you have a recombinant virus that now has a supposedly innocuous virus, but a protein from COVID. And so they're now developing a number of these vaccines based on this recombinant virus. And because it's a live virus, it will replicate, to some degree, and it can cause a really strong immune response. Now, that is cool. And I mean, as a scientist, I think that's kind of a cool idea. And at the same time, I would say that we haven't really seen those kinds of recombinant viruses used as vaccines before. There have been other types of, related types of technologies being used for other diseases like dengue virus and things like that. But these are really new. They've been used in the lab for other reasons, but never really done, with whole global populations. I'll give you kind of like an example of where we dodged a bullet. So one of the early versions of the polio vaccine was grown in monkey kidney cells. And they discovered a little while later that those cells also carried a tumor virus, simian virus 40, which turned out to cause tumors in mice. And so now we did this unintended experiment where millions of people were injected with poliovirus as well as a tumor virus. As it turns out, it doesn't cause tumors or cancers in people, so we dodged a bullet. But we didn't know. So again, like I said, I am still going to say, once we know we have a good vaccine, I will be in line to get that vaccine. But again, as a scientist, we know these stories. And so we are, sensitive to some of to be on the lookout for some of these issues.
So my next question has to do with that. How will we know? How will you know that the vaccine that you're in line to take is safe and effective?
The FDA has a long track record, at least the FDA we all used to know, has a long track record of knowing how to properly test drugs and vaccines. And so that's why, if you look at the childhood immunization schedule, there are dozens of vaccinations. And they've actually increased over years. And, they now include things like papillomavirus and things like that. And they are established to be very effective and very safe. So as long as we follow established procedures, we can count on that long track record of testing drugs and testing vaccines to be effective at determining which vaccines are going to work. And now let me also point out, it is likely, as with other vaccines, is that there may be several effective COVID vaccines that will be approved. And, just so you know, if you go to the drugstore, you have like 4 different choices just for the flu vaccine. And I know the University of California mandates you all get your flu shot, and I endorse that very much, but you got like 4 different choices to make, and they all work. So I expect the same thing to happen, where you're going to have several choices on the COVID vaccine. Some of them may have very specific recommendations. So, like for older adults, that they can recommend getting the quadruple dose flu shot, for example. The same might be true for the COVID vaccine. They may have a formulation. They said, well, if you're older, we suggest you get this one instead. So as I said, the FDA, if they follow their own rules, the committee that makes these guidelines and recommendations, they are prominent, well-established, experienced vaccinologists and so on. So I trust them to make those kinds of decisions. I think the state governments, as I said, some of the ones like California are going to also say, well, let's make sure they're going to do their own oversight to make sure that the vaccines that get out into the public are confirmed to have followed the rules. So for all those reasons, I would expect that we have reason to trust that the system that's been built over decades still works the way it's supposed to.
And is there a plan for distributing these vaccines, or do you know if the UC system has a plan for distributing the vaccine to its people?
I don't want to, okay. Well, the answer is no. However, there are some good general principles that people are sort of coming to a consensus on. So for example, we want our healthcare workers protected first. There is some discussion where vulnerable populations, we already talked about, Latino, African-American, populations. Now we think they should have early access to these because they're most vulnerable, especially people who are doing things like, say, essential work. If they're doing work, they're out, their jobs take them out into public and into contact. These are people who may be important to protect first. And that, those are the kinds of things. Now, but to answer your question, the issue is that, the devil's in the details. How do you implement that, right? How do you actually say, well, here's my card saying I'm an essential worker, give me my vaccine? I have not seen anything remotely resembling a plan to do that. And that's, hopefully we will have a government that will take that seriously soon.
Okay, so I have one last question before I open it up to, I just see we have some questions in the question. So is this our future? Or is this the first of many pandemics?
It's interesting. I thought about this question because, people talk about, when are we going back to normal and so on. So when I was in medical school, I've told this to a few people. When I was in medical school, the AIDS epidemic was just getting started. And on the one hand, it was kind of exciting because we were watching medical science happen live as they figured out what in the world was going on, why were these people dying, what was the causative agent, and so on. So the thing is, there was the 2009 swine flu pandemic. So I think it's funny for people to say, is this the only time we're going to see a pandemic? It's like, I may be old, I'm not that old, and I've already lived through several pandemics. So I don't know why people think, oh, is this the last one we're going to see? It's like, just because we invented antibiotics doesn't mean infectious disease has disappeared. So definitely we can count on future epidemics. I could go on a soapbox about how we're encroaching on wild areas and the contact with wild habitats is going to ensure we're going to discover new diseases to kill us. The government infrastructures, unless they start taking this kind of thing seriously, means that these kinds of global pandemics can still happen. Even now, with all the restrictions, you can get on a plane today and be anywhere in the world within 24 hours. So global spread of diseases is definitely possible. So yes, we can expect these things are still going to happen. And as I said, it's arithmetic. It's a combination of how easily a infectious agent can spread and how likely it's going to kill you if you catch it. That math is basically how biology works, right? So if one bug suddenly comes down from, it doesn't have to be bats, it could be armadillos in Texas or something like that. If it suddenly is easily spread and kills people, it's going to get out, right? And that's just arithmetic. So the question of normal then is what's going to happen. So I thought about this. It's like, I bet you can remember the days when the only way to contact a friend is that you had to find a phone booth and count on them to be home to answer the phone, right?
Yes.
Remember what life was like? So, what is normal? So I think it's really a question of, society and our basic working and living style has changed so much over time and we don't notice it.
Right.
Plus the fact that we have such short memory. So I think that to some degree, there's no, normal is just what we're doing now.
Right.
And as we accommodate things like, another example is like, I remember when I got onto a plane from a trailer in Orange County and didn't have to go through any kind of screening for firearms or anything like that.
Right.
It's now a part of you assume, I'm taking off my shoes, I'm,
right.
Things like that. So all of those things that we have to do to accommodate not spreading infectious diseases or, doing grocery shopping and not, touching everything. we will forget what it was like before.
Right.
And
Before.
it'll just be life, right?
Okay, so we have some questions from listeners. I'll begin with Sarita C's question. She has two. Do you have any insights to offer about the distribution of the vaccinations being developed by researchers at Oxford and the reported conflict between the scientists and the university administration over the corporate partnerships for distribution of the vaccine? That's one question she has. The second question is, the US mainstream and alternative news sources seem to uniformly ignore vaccination and antibody-related research in Asian countries. Do you have any information about progress in non-US and non-European countries, e.g. Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, China?
Oh, those are really excellent issues and questions. So as I said, so for example, before I came to the university, I had a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grant to develop a vaccine for, mucosal diseases. And at the time, there were two issues. One is that nobody was too worried about me, getting in bed with some, big drug company, because I was never going to make millions of dollars off of that vaccine. But more importantly, I could never get the vaccine off the ground because nobody wanted to invest in something that won't make profits. Now, with these kinds of warp speed, billions of dollars, throwing them at the wall and see what sticks, there is this issue of conflict of interest where academic researchers run the risk of many people just starting their own company or having some kind of lucrative deal with a drug company that expects to make billions of dollars off of it. That is not a new problem. We've seen many versions of that, not just in vaccine development, but all kinds of like academic research issues is like, how do you address these kinds of economic conflicts of interest? And I think we've really never solved it. And I'm sorry to say, we just have not solved it. And the best thing we have is the idea that, when you publish a paper, you're supposed to disclose your relationship with the company. I'm sorry, that's not a solution. That's just like, just so you know, I'm going to make millions of dollars off of this. And now you know who I'm getting the money from. That is unfortunately how the system is right now. The way things are set up in terms of society, industry, and things like that is that we also, unfortunately, don't have as much protection against charlatans and snake oil salesmen. So I don't know how many of you are taking Prevagen. I hope none of you are taking Prevagen, but this was some guy who was not even a scientist saying, I'm going to sell a protein from jellyfish and make millions of dollars so I can, spend it. It has never been actually tested for actual function, but it's selling hundreds of millions of dollars to people who buy into these commercials. So unfortunately, that's how the system is. And we have to inform ourselves about, what's the difference between getting FDA approval and, paying attention to the disclaimers at the bottom. This is not intended to treat or cure any disease. That's an unfortunate thing. And, we don't go into science because we think we're going to make millions of dollars, but it is all too attractive once you discover something that says, look, a drug company is now going to pay me millions for my discoveries. Like, it is too tempting for many people. And unfortunately, science can be degraded by that temptation. And as I said, we need to ensure that agencies such as the FDA stick to their guns and say, no, we're only going to prove this if it's really true. I mean, when I was in industry, when I was hiring people for my department, I said, unlike academic research, in a biotech company, I said, the thing is, if we find something, the difference is it actually has to be true. Now, that was the line I used. Now, whether that's really true is again, an issue that we have to address. Okay, but let me get to the other issue. The nationalism, the whole nationalism of science. There's a legitimate concern that science from other countries or other types of organizations and things like that may be dismissed because it's not like, it's not like old white males showing you. That is definitely a chauvinism in science issue. And, that's another longer term conversation. However, that is, and that goes to, social justice. So for example, anyway, the anti-malarial drug that actually had originally been developed in India, again, was being basically ignored for so long because it wasn't developed by old white Americans. And so the economic effects of that chauvinism were also evident because, the people who developed it weren't getting the economic rewards. So that is definitely a serious issue. And, it's like a Nobel Prize may not be enough to overcome that problem. And the hope is that if science is supposedly merit-based and supposedly evidence-based, that if something really works, people will pay attention and people will do something about that. And organizations such as the Gates Foundation are really actively trying to promote this whole equity issue and saying that science in Africa is just as good as science here. It's just somebody needs to publicize and promote and give access to investment and collaborators and things like that. So there's real serious work being done on this kind of issue. The Wellcome Trust is another organization doing that sort of thing. Seeking diversity and collaborative kind of inputs on these sorts of things. But yes, there are issues. There are people who are working on that. Now, on the other hand, there are other problems that we have to face where, for example, in China for a long time, science has had some kind of issues where the incentive system in China was not good in the sense that you could, enhance your income significantly just by publishing more papers. Well, that's kind of a perverse incentive. And so then the question is, does that mean the science will be suspect if your motivation is personal income rather than scientific rigor? And those are the kinds of issues that, as countries begin to address that, I know China's beginning to address that, then the credibility is there. If we do a better job at collaborating across international boundaries, then we can also promote that. Now, the NIH used to do a lot of that kind of things, funding a lot of international collaborative work, but as you can imagine, there's been a little bit of pullback in this country on that, not because of the scientists, but because of politics.
Okay, and then we have a couple of questions from Jeanette Cole. As a German, I watch German news on a daily basis. In the news 2 days ago, the German Association of Physicians strongly warned against a second lockdown and made a plea for an increased focus on the protection of vulnerable groups of people instead. Can you talk a little bit about reservations doctors might have against lockdowns and the possible health risks involved with those? What is your stance?
I think that's a little bit overlapping with our present government's herd immunity approach. It's like protect the old people in the nursing homes, but everybody else go wild. I think that's short-sighted. I think that, remember, people used to say that thing about this opening up the schools too. It's like, yeah, the kids are not going to be as affected, but somebody has to teach them, right? So adults have to go into those schools and teach them. In nursing homes, you can't just lock up the old people because somebody has to take care of them, right? So who are those people? Because they still have to go home at the end of the day. So I think that's kind of really not thinking as deeply about how diseases are spread. I mean, remember, in this country, the way the first parts of the pandemic started was in nursing homes in Washington State.
Right.
And so to think that, you know, the way our nursing homes and other kinds of, and schools and things like that are any kind of bubble or protected area from the rest of the community is just, in practice, we know that's not true. So.
I think in Ireland now, they've locked down everyone except the school children who are still going to school. And so they're, not only are there teachers in the school, but their kids are coming home. And it's not just young children, it's high schoolers too. So that seems completely contradictory.
Well, what was it? The NBA and some of these the idea that professional sports could be maybe housed in colonies and entertain us. It's like that didn't we call that apartheid or something like that? I don't know. I think there are rational ways to approach the question of protecting vulnerable individuals, but the most obvious one is everybody wear a mask.
Well, that was Jeanette's second question. Could you talk a bit about the effectivity of masks and what a science-based knowledge we have about that effectivity?
Well, I mean, the science on masks keeps piling up, saying that, yeah, it really works. And, even from population levels, I've now seen stuff where a couple of different states have done the natural experiment where some parts of the state, the enlightened government officials say, we have a mask mandate, everybody wear that, right? And the case rates plummet. And then in the more libertarian regions of the state to say, no, you do what you want to do. And the rates have continued to break records in terms of cases. So even the natural experiment's been done, and it's clear that the masks really do make a difference. And I think it's, of course, the masks do more than just say it covers your face and potentially protects you from the aerosols, but it's another thing is that it's part of a whole reminder every day of, yes, wash your hands, don't, touch everything and everybody. It's part of a whole, it's things like, if you go through TSA, not only are you going to take off your shoes and put your computer through the machine and things like that, but you're also not going to joke about carrying a bomb in your briefcase, right? It's like, it's part of that whole reminder, oh, I am going through TSA, I'm not going to make jokes about bombs, right? It's just like the mindset that's associated with this whole public behavior. And so I think the masks do more than just say, yes, that will protect you. Because if you do all the other things that your brain tells you to do as part of that behavior, then they will all help.
And then we have a series of questions from Michelle Bloom. So she says, what is your guess on the time frame of the COVID vaccine? Since it sounds like you're saying a year is possible, but not likely. And what about Sinopharm's vaccine in China that has been given to tens of thousands of people?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues with vaccines now. As I said, the technologies are there and they're testing tens of thousands of people in this country. So it is quite possible that if those technologies work, we will see something that could be approved within the year. I mean, I don't mean like the calendar year, but I mean like by spring or summer. What we don't know is whether or not, if it protects you for 3 months, will it protect you for a year? So, does the next season mean that we're all vulnerable again? We don't know the answer to that. So, but I wouldn't use that as an excuse to not take the vaccine. But I do, now, having a vaccine tested and approved doesn't mean you can get it, right? So as you were asking earlier, is there a plan for distributing the vaccine? That is probably as important a problem, is that even if one gets approved, doesn't mean you can get it. So there's a manufacturing issue. So for synthetic nucleic acids, for example, you can just fire up those chemistry plants and maybe manufacture large amounts. but some of the others, like the recombinant viruses, may take a lot longer to manufacture significant quantities. The related problem is for things like the recombinant vaccines, for example, is that you may need fancy -80-degree freezers in order to transport and store the vaccines. Well, most of our drugstores don't have those facilities. And if you go into more rural areas and things like that, there are many places who are just simply not going to have the infrastructure to store and transport vaccines even after they're approved. So we have a lot of logistical issues that we haven't addressed in terms of that. I'm sorry, what was the other part of that?
China.
Oh yeah, China. Yeah, the thing is, if we don't have the data on how effective the vaccine is, that would be an issue for the FDA to say, yes, just because it works, just because it's used in China, it will take it. The second thing is, again, back to the manufacturing and distribution. So even if China has an effective vaccine, are they in a position to manufacture enough, even if our FDA approves it, to distribute, right? I mean, China has, a few people there, more than us, right? So they probably have their own population to take care of too. So even if it works, and even if it's effective, and even if they have a good infrastructure for storing and transporting the vaccine, is there going to be enough, and when? I don't know. And yeah, I don't think it's as much of a scientific chauvinism issue, but some of it is just a logistical question. So it may be that Europe may have its own set of vaccines that works for them, but it works for them partly because they can manufacture and distribute it to their population.
Right. So Michelle also has a follow-up to Jeanette's question. Why is Taiwan able to do okay? Is it because people wear masks consistently and properly?
Yes. You had a government that acted quickly. You had a population that was willing to go along with the mandate. New Zealand did the same thing. South Korea. So it's not just Asians. I'm not saying Asians are the best people in the world, even if they are. But I think it's that thing. It's like, it's not freedom. It's not, I think Taiwan is certainly more free than the mainland. New Zealand is as free as Australia, and they still manage to control it. So yes, I think the first answer was the correct one. Yes.
So I think we're out of time, but I have one more question. It seems to me, so I've been looking at documentaries about World War II, like a lot of people. I mean, we kind of ramped up, right? Between 1941 and 1943, we ramped up. We had this huge, let's make bombs and let's make submarines and let's make, these LSTs. And we just kind of did it, right? I mean, for better or for worse, we ramped up. Can't we do that? If we get a vaccine, can't we just put everyone behind it and get it manufactured and get it out?
Yeah, it's really a matter of will. You're right. We did that, and I saw another comment here. It's like, is New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, are they just small enough to be effective? I think it's, somebody has described the pandemic in the United States not as one pandemic, but as 50 pandemics, because each state has its own local government and its ability to respond. And so if you look at the way it's spread across the United States, the spread really has everything to do with how the local governments responded. And so, yes, the density of the population might have been a factor, the size of the population might have been a factor, except that now we're seeing the case rate in rural areas
Right.
even worse than, you know, as bad or worse as it had been in New York or in California. So it's not so much the size of the population. It is really about a coordinated and responsible way of addressing the problem.
Okay, well, we don't want to take more of your time than we have, but we want to thank you so much, David, for this very informative, if somewhat sobering assessment.
Well, you know, as I was saying, it's like, it's not a question of new normal. It's just like, you know, life has always been changing.
Right.
And, you know, we adapt to circumstances. I cannot find a payphone to save my life. So we know things change. And I think it's something just that is part of how we develop. Look, I have an electric car in the garage. I mean, who had thought? I don't have a flying car. You know, I'm disappointed about that, but.
Well, I think if we all just have to wear masks all the time, that's not such a big deal. I mean, as long as I can see my relatives.
If you ever traveled in Asia, you know,
I know
that was always a common feature. So they managed to live with that. And or in Muslim countries where they you know, the women have covered up their faces, it was no barrier to expression and communication.
Right. Well, again, thank you so much. This has been truly great, sobering, but enlightening. So
I've had a lot of fun.
Good. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.